The morning Cecily Baird walked into St. Marguerite's Children's Hospital for the 47th time. She wasn't counting anymore. She used to count, back when her mother was still alive, and the waiting room on the third floor felt like something temporary. A place you passed through, not a place that became your address. Margaret Baird had spent 11 months in that hospital, and Cecily had spent 11 months beside her, doing homework on the vinyl chairs, eating vending machine sandwiches for dinner, learning which nurses worked nights and which ones would let her stay past visiting hours if she promised to be quiet. Her mother died on a Thursday in February. Cecily was 9 years old. She went home to the apartment on Renfrew Street that smelled like her mother's lotion, and she sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, not crying, just sitting, the way a person sits when they don't know what to do with their hands anymore. After that, she kept going back to the hospital. Not because anyone told her to. Not because she had a reason that would make sense to another adult, if there had been any adults paying close enough attention to ask. She went back because it was the last place her mother had been alive, because the nurses there still knew her name, because a girl of 9, and then 10, and then 11 needs somewhere to go where she does not feel entirely invisible. She wasn't invisible at St. Marguerite's. Sister Heloise at the front desk always waved her through. Old Gerald in the gift shop would set aside a crossword for her on Saturdays, and the patients, especially the children, they always had time for Cecily Baird, because when you are sick and frightened and you have nothing to do but wait, a visitor is a small miracle regardless of age. That was how she came to know room 14. She had heard the boy before she ever saw him, a low, ragged cough from behind a half-open door, and then a voice, small but surprisingly firm, saying, "I'm not tired. I already told you I'm not tired." Cecily stopped in the hallway. She could see through the gap in the door, a narrow hospital bed, a boy her own age maybe, dark circles under his eyes and an IV line taped to the back of his hand. A nurse was trying to adjust his blanket. He was resisting with what little energy he had, which was clearly not very much. "You don't look not tired," Cecily said before she could think better of it. The nurse startled. The boy turned his head toward the door. He had dark brown hair that hadn't been brushed in a while, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like lake water in October. He looked at Cecily with the careful, assessing gaze of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "I don't know you," he said. "I don't know you either," she agreed. "I'm Cecily. I'm not a patient. I come here a lot." "Why?" It was the kind of direct question that adults danced around, but children sometimes asked flat out, without cruelty, just curiosity. "My mom died here," she said. 2 years ago. I kind of never stopped coming." The boy was quiet for a moment. The nurse slipped out of the room, pretending she had something urgent to attend to down the hall. "I'm Emmett," he said finally. "Are you going to feel sorry for me? Should I?" He considered this. "Everyone does it help?" "No," he said. "Not really." Cecily looked at the IV line, the monitor beside his bed, the untouched cup of applesauce on the tray table. "Do you want me to stay for a bit? I don't have anywhere to be. And I'm pretty good at crosswords if you have one." Emmett Tate looked at her for a long time with those October water eyes. "I have Uno," he said. She learned about his liver on her third visit, not from Emmett, from Nurse Danielle, who pulled Cecily aside in the hallway and said, carefully, that Emmett's condition was serious and that it might be hard for Cecily to watch, and that nobody would blame her if she chose to visit less often. Cecily listened to all of this and then said, "What kind of transplant?" Nurse Danielle blinked. "I'm sorry? He needs a transplant, right? That's what serious means in here. What kind?" There was a pause in which Danielle seemed to be deciding how much a 12-year-old could handle. "A partial liver transplant," she said at last. "He's been on the waiting list for 8 months. 8 months. Cecily thought about her mother's 11. Is there a living donor option? There can be. For liver transplants, a living donor can sometimes donate a portion. The liver regenerates. But donors have to meet very specific medical criteria. It's not a simple thing." Cecily nodded like she was filing this information away. That night she went home to the apartment on Renfrew Street. She was living there alone, which was something the school didn't know about, and which a neighbor named Mrs. Olufemi quietly helped her manage. And she looked up liver transplants on the public library computer for 2 hours. She was 12 years old, and she made a decision that 12-year-olds are not supposed to be able to make. But Cecily Baird had been making adult decisions since she was 9, and she had learned that waiting for someone else to handle things was a luxury she couldn't afford. She went to the transplant coordinator at St. Marguerite's the following Monday and asked to be tested. The woman behind the desk, whose name was Patricia Voss, looked at Cecily with an expression that moved through surprise, concern, and professional care in rapid succession. "Sweetheart, how old are you?" 12. "Almost 13. Do you have a parent or guardian I can speak with?" "No." Another pause. "I see. And does the patient know you're here?" "No," Cecily said, "and I'd like to keep it that way for now, if that's possible." Patricia Voss looked at this girl, her second-hand winter jacket, her careful, tired eyes, her absolute stillness, and she said, "I can't make you any promises, but let me get the right people involved." What Patricia Voss got involved was, among others, a child welfare coordinator, a hospital ethicist, a transplant surgeon, and, eventually, a lawyer. What she did not immediately get involved was Emmett's father. Emmett's father was a man named Raymond Tate. He was 49 years old, and he ran a construction and real estate development company called Tate Aldford Group that was responsible for roughly a third of the significant commercial building done in the lower mainland of British Columbia over the previous 15 years. He had 712 employees. He owned a house in West Vancouver, with a view that people paid photographers to capture. He also had not been to see his son in 4 days. This was not, his assistant would later explain to anyone who asked, because Raymond Tate was a bad father. It was because Raymond Tate was a man who had built his entire adult life around action, around problems that could be solved, obstacles that could be cleared, timelines that could be accelerated with enough resources. And Emmett's illness was a problem that Raymond Tate's considerable resources could not fix, because livers do not respond to capital, and waiting lists cannot be shortened by knowing the right people. Every time he sat in that hospital room and looked at his son's face, he felt something he had no framework for. Powerlessness. It sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. So he stayed away and told himself he was being useful elsewhere, which was the lie that men like Raymond Tate tell themselves when they cannot bear to be still. He did not know, on the Thursday morning when his assistant called to tell him there was a situation at the hospital requiring his immediate presence, that the situation was a 12-year-old girl in a second-hand jacket who had asked to give his son part of her liver. The drive from his Burnaby office to St. Marguerite's took 22 minutes. Raymond Tate made it in 15. He was met in the main corridor by Patricia Voss, the ethicist Dr. Chen, and a woman from Child Services named Margaret Ann Buckley, who shook his hand with the specific gravity of a person delivering serious news. "There's a girl," Patricia Voss began. "Her name is Cecily Baird. She's 12. She's been a regular visitor to the pediatric ward for about 2 years now. And 3 weeks ago she presented herself to our transplant team and asked to be evaluated as a living donor for Emmett." Raymond Tate heard the words in the correct order, but it took a moment for them to assemble into meaning. "She's? What? She's a child, she is. The legal and ethical situation is complex. Her blood type is compatible with Emmett's. Her preliminary health screening came back remarkably well. She is, medically speaking, a potential candidate. She's 12, he said again, because this seemed to him to be the most important fact in the room. Living donation in adolescence is exceptionally rare and requires extraordinary ethical review, Dr. Chen said carefully. "We are not proceeding without full legal guardianship clarity, a formal ethics board ruling, and extensive psychological evaluation of both the donor candidate and the situation. But the family, there is no family, is what we need you to understand. She has no guardian we can locate. She's been effectively living alone since her mother died." Raymond Tate stood very still. "How long?" 2 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Down the hallway, through a closed door, his son was sleeping or pretending to sleep, which was what Emmett had been doing lately, building small walls out of closed eyes and turned shoulders. "Where is she now?" Raymond asked. "Waiting room? B wing? Take me to her." Cecily was doing a crossword when he came in. She had her pen cap between her teeth and her feet tucked up under her on the vinyl chair, and she looked up when the door opened with an expression that was not frightened. Not quite, but watchful, the way a person looks when they've learned to read a room before committing to a feeling. Raymond Tate was a large man. He took up space without trying. He sat down in the chair across from her, not the chair beside her, so she wouldn't feel cornered. "You're Cecily," he said. "You're Emmett's dad." He nodded. She waited. "I want to understand," he said, "why you would do this." Cecily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her crossword, like she was thinking about whether to answer honestly, which she had found over the years was often a genuine choice. "My mom waited for a transplant for 11 months, she said. She didn't get one. I kept thinking, afterward, that somewhere there was probably a person who could have helped, who maybe would have, if they'd known. But they didn't know, or it didn't match, or the timing was wrong, or whatever, and she died. And I thought about that a lot." Raymond Tate said nothing. She kept going. "Emmett's been here 8 months. 8 months is a long time when you're 11 and everything hurts. And I thought, I looked it up. I read everything I could find. You only need part of a liver. The rest grows back. And if the blood type matches and you're healthy enough." She shrugged, a small, precise movement. "My mom didn't get lucky. Maybe Emmett could." The room was very quiet. "You didn't know anything about us," Raymond said. "About our family. About who Emmett is. I know he cheats at Uno when he thinks you're not paying attention," Cecily said. "And he won't eat the applesauce, but he'll eat the Jell-O if it's the red kind. And he gets scared at night, but he doesn't want anyone to know. And he's been waiting for 8 months. She paused. That's enough to know. Raymond Tate had been in boardrooms for 3 decades. He had sat across from investors and lawyers and city councilors and the occasional person who was actively trying to ruin him. He had learned, over years, to keep his face composed, because composed was what the situation required. He could not, in that moment, keep his face composed. He turned toward the window. Outside, a light rain was coming down the way it always did in November, steady and gray and indifferent. He stayed looking at it until he was able to speak again. "The doctors say there are still a process, that it may not be approved." "I know," Cecily said, "but it's worth trying." "Why?" His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Why is it worth it to you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because someone should have tried for my mom," she said simply, "and they didn't, and I don't want that to be Emmett's story." It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of ethics board meetings and legal proceedings to establish temporary guardianship. Margaret Ann Buckley worked faster than anyone thought possible, and Raymond Tate's lawyers worked alongside the Child Services Office with a cooperative focus that his lawyers privately noted they had never seen him apply to anything before. 6 weeks of psychological evaluations, of a surgeon named Dr. Osi Bonsu, who spoke carefully with Cecily about what the surgery would mean, the risks, the recovery, the particular reality of a 12-year-old's body doing something it wasn't built to do. 6 weeks of Cecily sitting across from every professional who needed to look her in the eye and ask, "Do you really understand? Do you really understand?" And every time she said, "Yes," without drama, without hesitation. With the particular steadiness of a child who has already survived the worst thing and who therefore knows, better than most adults, exactly what they are willing to risk. The ethics board approved the evaluation to proceed. It was not a guarantee of the surgery itself. That would require one more round of medical assessment, but it was the door opening. Raymond Tate found out on a Wednesday afternoon. He sat in his car in the hospital parkade for 10 minutes before going inside. Emmett didn't know any of it until his father sat down beside his bed on a rainy Thursday evening and told him. He explained it the way he had been coached to, carefully, without pressure, without making Emmett feel that anything had been decided on his behalf. He explained who Cecily was, what she had asked, what the doctors were still determining. He explained that nothing was guaranteed, that there were still decisions to be made, that Emmett could have feelings about all of this that were complicated and valid and welcome. Emmett listened without interrupting, which was new. He had been interrupting people for most of his life, a trait his mother had found charming and his teachers had found less so. He lay very still and listened to his father's voice explaining this impossible thing, and when Raymond finished, Emmett was quiet for a long moment. "She didn't tell me," he said. "She didn't want to get your hopes up until she knew more." "She comes to play Uno with me 3 times a week," Emmett said. "And she didn't. She never said anything." "No." Another silence. Then, "Can I see her?" Raymond said he would ask. Cecily was in the common room down the hall. doing a puzzle with a 6-year-old named Theo who was in for his tonsils and who had an opinion about every single puzzle piece that he was not shy about sharing. She looked up when Raymond appeared in the doorway. "He wants to see you," Raymond said. Cecily handed Theo the piece she was holding, straightened up, and followed Raymond down the hall without a word. The room was quieter than usual. The monitor beeped its steady, mechanical heartbeat. Emmett was sitting up in bed, which was unusual. He usually lay flat, because sitting up took energy he didn't have to spare. But he had made the effort. Cecily stood in the doorway. "You could have told me," Emmett said. "You would have told me not to do it." A pause. "Yeah," he admitted. "Probably." She came in and sat in the chair she always sat in to his left, where the IV wasn't. She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm still not sure it's going to work," she said. "There's a lot of steps. I might not clear the last tests, but you want to try." "I already tried. I've been trying for 6 weeks. She looked at him. "You've been waiting 8 months. I've been waiting 2 years to be able to do something that means anything. This is the thing." Emmett looked at her with those lake-water eyes, and for the first time in a long time there was something in them that was not gray. His father, standing in the doorway behind Cecily, did not trust himself to speak. She cleared the final assessments on a Monday in January. Surgery was scheduled for the 14th of February. The date was the kind of coincidence that people would remark on later, the story told at dinner tables with a smile. Valentine's Day, of all things, the day a 12-year-old girl gave her own body's generosity to a boy she had met over a deck of Uno cards. Raymond Tate spent the night before the surgery in the family lounge on the 3rd floor because there was nowhere else on earth he could have made himself be. He sat with coffee going cold in his hand and thought about the last 2 years of his son's life, the doctor's appointments he had attended, and the ones he had sent his assistant to instead, the evenings he had worked late and told himself Emmett understood. He thought about what it cost a person to be the kind of father who shows up, and why that had ever seemed like too high a price. Cecily, in the room they had arranged for her 2 floors up, called Mrs. Olufemi from the bedside phone. Mrs. Olufemi, who was 73 and who had been slipping Cecily grocery money for 2 years without mentioning it to anyone, said, "I'm proud of you, child. I've been proud of you for a long time. Don't make me cry," Cecily said. "My eyes'll be puffy for the photos." Mrs. Olufemi laughed. "Go to sleep." The surgery lasted 9 hours. Raymond Tate drank 4 coffees he didn't taste and walked the length of the 3rd-floor corridor approximately 40 times. Margaret Ann Buckley sat with him for a while, and then Dr. Obonzuzu's resident came to give updates at the 2-hour mark, and the 4-hour mark, and the 7. At 9 hours and 18 minutes, Dr. Ozi Bonzu came out with his mask pulled down and his hands free, and he said the words that Raymond Tate had not fully allowed himself to believe he would ever hear. Both of them were stable. He sat down in the nearest chair and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and he stayed like that for long enough that the passing nurse laid a quiet hand on his shoulder. Emmett woke up first, which surprised everyone given that he had been the sicker of the two. He asked for his father before he asked for water, which made the recovery room nurse write a note in the margin of her report because she had never seen that happen before. Raymond was there in 4 minutes, red-eyed and without his tie, having abandoned it somewhere around hour 6. "Hey, Dad," Emmett said, in a voice like gravel and relief. Raymond held his son's hand and did not say anything at all, which was, for a man who had spent 30 years building things with words, the most complete sentence he had ever managed. Cecily woke up 8 hours later. She woke up slowly, the way you do when your body has been through something enormous and is not yet prepared to commit to the surface world. The first thing she registered was pain, dull and deep and significant, and then light, and then a face she didn't expect. Raymond Tate sitting in the chair beside her bed. He looked like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. "Emmett," she said. "Awake, stable. Asking everyone what time it is because he wants to know if his favorite show is on." A small, exhausted sound came out of Cecily that was almost a laugh. Raymond Tate looked at this girl, at the second-hand kid who had walked into a hospital 2 years ago with nowhere better to be, and had spent those 2 years finding a purpose in other people's difficult days, and had quietly, methodically, with absolutely no drama and no expectation of reward. "I need to talk to you," he said. About some things. When you're feeling up to it." "What things?" "Your apartment. Your school situation." Mrs. Olufemi, who called this morning and who I gather has been looking out for you, and who I'd like to properly thank." He paused. "The fact that you've been alone for 2 years, and no one did enough about it." Cecily studied his face. She was very good at reading people. She had learned it in waiting rooms and hospital corridors, and she had learned it young. "You feel guilty," she said. "A little, yes. About a number of things. You shouldn't feel guilty about me. You didn't. No, but I know now." He leaned forward slightly. "I have a son who is going to need someone in his corner for a long time, someone who knows him and who he trusts, and who isn't going to feel sorry for him." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't have much of that." Cecily was quiet. "I'm not going to pretend I know what the right thing looks like," Raymond said. "I'm not going to tell you what you want. You've been deciding things for yourself for 2 years, and I'm not going to walk in here and override that. But I would like, very much, to talk about what comes next, what you need, what might be possible." He paused. "If you're open to it." She looked at him for a long time. "Mrs. Olufemi makes very good soup," she said finally. "If you're going to thank her properly, you should let her cook." Something shifted in Raymond Tate's face. Not quite a smile. He was too tired for a full smile. But something. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Spring came slowly that year, the way spring comes in British Columbia, sideways and reluctant, testing the air before committing. By April, the cherry blossoms along the west side of the hospital grounds were doing their brief, extravagant best, and 2 children sat on a bench beneath them in the pale afternoon light. A boy with an IV port no longer in his arm, and a girl with a healing scar she was already matter-of-fact about. Emmett was describing, in detail, a video game he had been prohibited from playing for the past 4 months and had finally been permitted to return to. Cecily was listening with the expression she used when she was paying attention. "You're not actually listening," Emmett said. "I'm partially listening. What are you thinking?" "Think about." She looked at the blossoms for a moment. "Mrs. Olufemi made Raymond cry at dinner last week," she said. "With the soup. He held it together for most of the meal, and then she said something about my mom and he just cried. Right there at the table. Was it weird? A bit. Also kind of nice." She paused. "He's going to try to adopt me." Emmett turned to look at her. "Yeah," he asked, properly. "With a lawyer and everything, but also," he asked, "said I didn't have to decide anything yet. That there was no pressure and no timeline." She picked at a loose thread on her jacket. "I think he means it." "He does," Emmett said. "Dad doesn't say things he doesn't mean. It's actually kind of annoying when you want him to say something polite about something." Cecily smiled at that. A real one, not the careful kind she had learned to produce when situations required it. The actual smile, the one that reached her eyes. "What are you going to say?" Emmett asked. She looked at the cherry blossoms coming down around them like the world was trying to be kind. "I think I'm going to say yes," she said. Emmett leaned back on the bench. "Cool," he said, in the tone of someone who had hoped for exactly this outcome and was very deliberately not making a big deal of it. They sat there a while longer, the 2 of them, under the blossoms, in no hurry to be anywhere else. For the first time in a long time, Cecily Baird was not counting days. She was not measuring absence or calculating how much longer something might last. She was simply sitting in a moment that was, for once, enough, and she was letting herself feel it without bracing for what came after. It turned out that was what it felt like. To stop waiting. To arrive.